How's it going? All right. So, in the philosophical canon, in the epistemological realm of philosophy specifically, you generally speaking have two frameworks that in the 20th century came to be termed representationalism and realism. The philosophers, the modern philosophers and the ancient philosophers who we most powerfully associate with these two different traditions do not necessarily use those kinds of terms, but they're terms applied post facto to the history of philosophy by historians and historiographers. So realism, a really good example of realism is Aristotle and a few other. I think Epicurus, for example, is a realist, and there seems to be, for one reason or another, a lot of ancient realists. But the basic idea is that the representations that you have in your mind, the images that you deal with in thinking, over the course of your thought processes, the actual like substance of thought itself is meant to be like a real thing. It is so when you have like an image, when you perceive something like some book or whatever on the desk in front of you, the light hits it, and then the light enters through your eye into your brain and thereby into your mind. So the image of the book that you're dealing with is in some way like fundamentally connected to the book that you see. It is real in that sense. You're really dealing with like a literal object, a literal representation of the book. Whereas the representationalists are very different type of like epistemology, where instead of like considering the objects as being the thought objects as being real objects, we're talking about thought objects as impressions that are made on the mind, and you're actually dealing with representations of external phenomena. So when you see a book or whatever, when you have some kind of external like sense-based impression, the light from the book or whatever like will hit your eye, and then it will enter into your brain, and then through some more or less magical, or like through some like complex convoluted philosophical mechanism, the image turns from a physical sense-based representation into something that your mind is able to deal with. It like hits the outer layer of your mind, leaves an impression, and then from there it is able to enter into your mind and into your thought as this kind of something, the substance of which your mind is able to grasp and deal with. It's not a real thing, it's a representation of a real thing. So a lot of modern philosophers are representationalists, like Descartes is a representationalist, Berkeley, I don't know if Spinoza, I think Spinoza might actually be a realist, but Hume and Kant, very famously. Kant kind of took this to a limit, as he did a lot of things in his philosophy, and cast some doubt on the validity of things that are outside of ourselves. I mean, the challenge for the representationalists is to account for phenomena outside of ourselves, because if you can't do that, then you're at a real risk of falling into nihilism. And most philosophy, maybe perhaps all philosophy, is really a struggle against nihilism and meaninglessness. So Kant casts some. Hume actually really kind of broke things by saying that we don't really know that the object outside of us is real, because all we are really dealing with are these representations, and we also don't have any kind of causal link between representations between like one moment in time and another. We cannot infer that there's like a causal link a priori, but really we can just like say that we're having this experience of causality, of connected causality, and the best we can do is like say statistically to one extent or another whether something is likely. We cannot say that it is certain to happen. And then he kind of left off his philosophy, which really was a kind of chaotic place to leave philosophy. And Kant, he was very strongly motivated to try to deal with that problem that had been left to him by Mr. David Hume, Scottish philosopher, writing about a century before Kant, if my memory serves correct, maybe even less, maybe like 50 years or something. But so you have these two different epistemological frameworks, representationalism and realism. And I know a bit more about representationalism than I do realism. And when you're thinking in terms of representationalism, you can say something that might sound alarming to a fool who doesn't know how to take words absent some kind of like value judgment. A word like alienation, you can say that in a representational framework you're alienated from the object because there's a mediating structure between you and the object, and you cannot actually deal with the object directly because you're only you never have direct experience of the object. You only deal with a representation, a impression left on your mind by an object that may or may not exist. So there's this alienation from it in a sense because again there's this mediating structure. So I made a few videos several days ago, last week. The puppy's barking. I don't know if you can hear that, but so I made a few videos about software, the command line, and graphical programs, and I was trying to talk about how, in my view, like graphical interfaces are alienating to one extent or another, like whether or not you really want to make like a strong value judgment. Maybe I did, maybe I want to walk that back a little bit, but in my view, graphical user interfaces are alienating because there is this visual medium between yourself and whatever computing processes it is that you're doing. There is this structure that separates you from the object, so you're not able to deal with it directly. You're not able to deal with the software directly. You're only able to deal with like this visual framework and like click icons. They are symbolic representations of processes that are set off by a user interaction. So I mean, and it's certainly true that like in computing there's always going to be some level of alienation because nobody is like making their own hardware, nobody is writing their own kernel, nobody is really like communicating with their computer in machine code and like trying to move electrons around manually. Like that is not what is happening at all. But my point here is that so with that in mind, like it's impossible to not be, to a greater or lesser extent, alienated from your computer, from the software, and from the internet as well, from all of these things that we take for granted and which are very important in contemporary society. But I guess my point is that this visual structure is more alienating. You can be more or less alienated from your computer, and this visual structure needing to interact with your software and with the processes that you want your software, that you want your computer to do through this visual framework is a form of alienation. It is an additional form of alienation to dealing, like using a command line piece of software where you just write in code, and the code that you're writing in it's not really code in the strictest sense. It's just like options that you're passing to the piece of software. I know that I'm boring anybody who is not already interested or to some extent knowledgeable about this sort of thing, but basically my overall point here is that these kinds of visual frameworks are limiting. They're more limiting than using a non-visual framework, like interacting with computers non-visually, because you're working within this mediating structure, which is an additional mediating structure to like the already mediating structure of the piece of software itself. When you're using a command line piece of software, of course you're again not writing a machine code. You're writing, like, you're passing options to a piece of software that's written in C, for example, which then translates that into machine code. So there are many like mediations along the way, but you can be more or less alienated. There are degrees of alienation here. Yeah, I guess that's all I'll say on the matter. I mean, I know that I should have put this out last week when I was talking about this sort of thing consistently. But that's all I'll say on the topic, and we're going to have a good week on the channel. I've got several good topics that I want to discuss, and thanks to everybody who came out to the live stream yesterday. It was really fun talking to everybody. There'll be another live stream again next Sunday, every Sunday going forward, 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. But yeah, I'll check back with you later, and see you until then.